I think it's safe to say, Bill, you are a pilot's pilot, and we're honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, John, for that warm introduction. I got to tell you, I feel like a youngster. I did pass 75 not long ago, but I feel like a youngster in front of the panel that will be speaking with you today, and many of you in the audience, not only in age but in experience. But I feel a very special place in my heart for Pan American. Pan American is absolutely unique in this world. One way to demonstrate that is, since I've been here just 24 hours on this visit, I've met people that are here today and were here yesterday, and they're here because they support and love Pan Am, even though they have no family member attachment. They were once a passenger, and they've come across the country to be here to pay tribute to Pan Am. I think that tells a lot about you and about us. I think that we're just very, very special in this whole industry. The early vision of our leaders was good, but the thing that really made it work was the people, and many of whom are you folks in the audience. There's no other airline that has going for them what we have. Pan Am chose the very best people. They provided excellent training, and then they gave the crew the key to the airplane and sent them out around the world. That's a lot different than most point A to point B airline kinds of operations around the world. The passengers, our international passengers, also appreciated Pan Am. I can't tell you how many times I've had them come to me and say, it's just like going home to get back on your airplane. This morning, we will relive some of those experiences and flights and share them with you. And we'll start with some of that coming from the panel, and then we're going to invite all of you to join in with questions, and hopefully we can provide answers. Not me, I'm the youngster, but these fellows can. And we'll also be happy to hear some of your, time permitting, some of your experiences that you'd like to share with us. Can we start with a show of hands of those folks that have served as a crew member, cabin, or cockpit with Pan American? There's a bunch of experience. How about those that served on the boats? We'll start that question and answer period before long, but now let me please introduce your panel, starting with Ross Butler. Ross was raised on a wheat farm in Idaho. Before the time of tractors, he not only rode a horse to school, but used horses to do their farming. During World War II, he went to Arizona in flight school and stayed on as an instructor. Typically, the Army in those days picked the very best people to stay on and be instructors. Ross was one of them. He instructed in aerobatics and cross-country courses. And during that time, Jack Tilton was the manager of flying here at Treasure Island for Pan Am, and he would communicate with those pilots and offer some of them jobs. And Ross turned him down until one period after a 3-month period where he had 6 forced landings, 3 of them in fields off airports. He says, okay, I'm gonna go fly with Pan Am. Ross's first line trip with Pan Am was to Pearl in a B-314. We have Dave Bridges, Captain Ross Butler and Captain Dave Bridges. Dave is a native Californian. He was born and raised right here in the Bay Area. He loved aviation right from the start. He has watched Lindbergh fly out from Oakland. He watched the dirigibles, the Macon, and the Dole flights, and the sky was in his heart right from the start. He worked for Paul Mance on Sikorsky's, the S-38 and the 39. He took a primary CPT training here at SFO, then called Mills Field. After his primary training, he went to aerobatics, did commercial and instructor training in 1942, and taught Army primary flight training in Stearman's. He was hired by Pan Am at Treasure Island in the spring of 1944. I was 14 years old. Hugh Gourdin, on my left, was a flight engineer at Pan Am. Hugh spent his early teen years at an English boarding school. And then as a teenager, he was in San Francisco, graduated from Galileo High School, and then on across the bay to Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, where he studied engineering with an option for aeronautics. In May of 1940, between his junior and senior year at Berkeley, he applied for a job at Pan Am, and a job in the engineering department, and he was hired. He did so well that the company kept him on part-time payroll throughout his college career, and then hired him after he graduated. Hugh was first an apprentice engineer in Martin 130s and 314s. He soon was promoted to junior engineer, and then to flight engineer, and then to check engineer for some like 17 years, I think it was. Check engineer on the Martin 130s and the B314s. In August of 1982, Hugh retired after 42 years of flying boats, all up through 747s. Ralph Conley, last member this morning to be introduced, was born and raised in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Ralph's at the end of the panel table. After graduation, he took courses in radio operations at the Massachusetts Radio School in Boston, or Boston, however you pronounce it. Next was a job in broadcast station activity in Vermont, and in 1940, he heard that Pan American was considering hiring radio operators in Miami, so he went there. He got hired, and in his training, and I'm going to let him tell more about this, but he flew the old Commodores and the S-38s, and then went on to the S-40, and his principal seaplane experience was in those airplanes, and then the S-42 in the Atlantic and the Caribbean side. Later, he did fly the 307, the pressurized tail dragger for Pan Am, and he was involved in the restoration. Many of you probably know about that. Some of it happened right here at our airport at SFO. We had expected Beverly Cowden to be here today to represent the stewardesses, flight attendants, in-flight service. The names have changed, but Beverly was unfortunately unable to make it. Mr. Hill did introduce Gene, and he can probably answer a question or two. Gene's body's frail, but his mind's sharp as a tack. Let's get to that point now where we'll ask the panel members to tell us just a little bit about the training that they had for their position and the requirements for employment. Ross, can you lead off with that, please, for pilots?
Yes, we had a variety of courses in meteorology, power plants, cruising control, the history of Pan Am and their treaties with foreign nations, and navigation. We had a navigation checkout for celestial navigation. We made a trip to Hawaii and back to check out the navigation portion, and I enjoyed all of it. The airplane I hired with Pan Am in 1943 after a rigorous physical and then a check right into PBM with Ken Beer, and they put me out on my familiarization flight, 314 to Pearl Harbor and back to Treasure Island. And I was an extra on that trip, and then the next trip I was a regular member of the crew. That was Captain Halverson on that trip.
Thank you, Ross. Hugh Gourdin, can you talk to us a little bit about requirements to be hired as a flight engineering officer and the training?
Well,
Did you have to go to an English boarding school?
No, I had a very unprepossessing beginning because of Pan Am's personnel department on Treasure Island consisted of one person. And I don't remember having a rigorous physical. I turned off the Bay Bridge one day at the end of the spring semester at Berkeley, knowing that I wanted a summer job, and I'd heard of this vacancy as an engineering clerk for the engineering department of Pan Am. I did it strictly on a should I or shouldn't I basis, and I did, and it changed my life. I started working in the engineering department as a clerk, and just as Mr. Davies said yesterday, it was a small airline. The engineering department was right next to operations, and the only separation was filing cabinets and bookcases. So it was a matter of learning on the job. Flight engineers came from two sources to Pan Am. There were a number of college graduates, such as myself, and then there were a large number of men from the maintenance departments who had shown aptitudes for it, and they got jobs as flight engineers. But the training was without simulators. It was strictly on the job, handling the machinery. The college people needed the practical aspects of maintaining the airplanes that the maintenance people had, and the maintenance people had to learn a few other things from the college people. Those were the two main sources of the flight engineers for Pan Am. The war accelerated all training, I think, and it was not formalized as much as on the job training. It's not like what it is today with simulators and elaborate ground schools and presentations of that sort.
Thank you, Hugh. Ralph, would you follow the lead and tell us a little bit about the requirements and training you experienced?
Is this on or off?
It's on. It should be on.
Is that on?
Yeah.
And Hugh's
Okay.
a professional radio man.
Right, the newfangled equipment. I use CW. Well, Ralph Conley, I joined Pan American in November of '40 in the old Eastern Division of Miami, and started out flying the boats, of course, from down there. I'd like to back up a little bit. I know some of you know this information, but I would like to. And this is sort of a rounded off list of events in the early days of Pan Am. They were incorporated in October 1927. The first revenue flight was October 28, 1927, with only mail, no passengers. Flight was Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. Plane was a Fokker F-7. The first fare-pairing passengers flew on January 16, 1928, Key West to Havana. One-way fare was $50. At the start of the airline, the principals were Juan T. Tripp, of course, founder and president, Andre Priester, who was in charge of engineering and safety of flight, and Hugo Luderitz, communications. Number one pilot was Hugh Wells. I think he came from some other airline, but I'm not sure. Other top seniority pilots, of course, were Ed Music, navigator pilot Bob Fatt, Casper Swinson, Basil Rowe, who was acquired when his West Indian Area Express was bought up. George Snow, same thing with the Boston and Maine Colonial Airways. There were also many other significant pilots, of course, in the early days. In 29 and 30, Pan Am absorbed the New York, Rio, Buenos Aires airline, NERBA. As a result, Pan Am received 14 consolidated Commodores, probably the world's best commercial airliner at the time. By the end of 1932, Pan Am had 121 total aircraft, 135 airports and bases, 61 ground radio stations in 27 countries. The early radio stations and aircraft were usually an adaptation of ship's radio, resulting in horrific weights. For example, 300 pounds for an installation. And needless to say, that was not very acceptable. When Hugo Luderitz became involved, he developed a 10-pound radio transmitter and lightweight receivers. So the total weight, batteries, DF, loop, and antenna was less than 40 pounds. Of course, you had to have a umpteen-pound flight radio operator in addition, but it had already been determined that a flight radio operator would be an essential member of the crew. Pan Am operated many land planes in the early days, the Fairchild FC-2, the Fokker 7 and 10, Ford Trimotors, Consolidated Fleetsters. It appears that the first flying boat that I could find was the Loning C2C air yacht. Pan Am bought 12 of them with first delivery in 1929. A major boost was given to use of flying boats when Pan Am and Sikorsky Aero Engineering Corporation got together. The first Sikorsky was an S-36 leased to Pan Am in December 1927 and returned to Sikorsky in February 1928. Then began a long series of deliveries, 39 S-38s, which at the time were approximately $51,000, with first delivery to Pan Am in 10/31/28 and ending in 3/31/33. There were 3 S-41s, 1929 to 31, absorbed from Boston Maine Airways. 3 S-40s delivered 10/10 and 8/30/32. 10 S-42s delivered 6/5/34 through 1937. And I personally believe that the S-42 was the airplane that Juan Trippe decided he could have an overseas airline that would make a profit. As you know, all of the survey flights were done at both coasts on the S-42. So that was the beginning sort of thing. I know everybody out here has probably read the same things. Personally, as I said, I joined Pan Am in Eastern Division, started flying on the old Commodores with typically with pilot training or navigator training, graduated the S-43s and trips to Nassau, and there was a period of checkout, so-called. When you checked out on all routes in Pan American in those days, you got to wear a gold band on your head and a special $15 raise for your pocketbook. And that was when you were checked out with all routes from Miami through Rio. The better airplanes at that time, of course, were the S-42 and the little S-43, which people got to calling the baby clipper. I think Bill filled in my early days from being a Vermont kid and so forth. So that's about it at the moment. I have some pictures and whatever. You'd like to see them later.
Thank you, Ralph. I saved Dave Bridges for last because rather than repeating the requirements for employment and training, I wanted him to talk about the technological progress of the clippers in the Pacific. Before he starts, you probably all know that the S-42 was the airplane that was used for the proving run. Initially, I think it was April 16th in 1935, and it was flown by Captain Eddie Musick. Here in the audience today somewhere is his nephew, Jim Musick. Jim is down from the mountains of Northern California, and he's seated over here. Nice to have you with us, Jim. Now, Dave, would you, he's a technical whiz. He knows all the numbers and range, and boy,
not really.
So we'll turn him loose on that subject for a few minutes.
Thank you, Bill. In 1944, I was a flight instructor, civilian teaching Army primary at Hancock College of Aeronautics in Santa Maria, California. And I was going out the gate one evening after flying, and I heard somebody say, "Hey, there's a representative from Pan Am in the office looking for pilots." Wow, that was what I liked. And I went back and walked in the office, and the representative was giving 3 fellows that they'd found a little story about Pan Am. And when he finished, I introduced myself, asked him for an application. And I had to talk a little bit to him, and finally he gave me an application, and I filled it out, and we all departed. About 3 days later, 2 of the fellows got a telegram to report to Treasure Island, and another day or two, the third fella got a telegram, and about 5 or 6 days later, I got a telegram to report. When I got up to Treasure Island, I found the first two had not made the physical examination, and the third guy and myself passed it okay, and we went out and, like Ross, had a check ride in the PBM, which at that time to me was about the biggest airplane it ever was. Anyway, we both passed that, and on May 5th, 1944, I was hired by Pan Am, and I went through all the training that Ross mentioned. We were sent out to a little airport near Concord called Sherman Field, and I always thought that was kind of a beautiful little place, like an English airdrome. It had oak trees and a hangar with a round roof, and it had grass, and it was really pretty. But now it's deep under a 12-lane freeway. But anyway, I flew all the airplanes that Pan Am had. One airplane that I had a training flight on was only a few minutes, and I hope nobody is here from Lockheed, but I couldn't fit in the cockpit. I'm 6'5", or used to be, and they said, okay, you're next. So I got in the cockpit, tried to get in the cockpit, and I seat all the way back, all the way down, rudder pedals all the way forward. I couldn't get the yoke over my knees. So they said, well, that's all for you. You go to the Boeing Stratocruiser 377. So, hey, that was my airplane. That was lots of room in that. But anyway, I went all through the other airplanes, and retired on the 747, which also was a good airplane. But anyway, I'd like to give you a little thumbnail view of the first three airplanes that Pan Am used out here in the Pacific. Pan Am bought or located themselves on the Alameda Airport, Alameda, California, that was just next to the Alameda San Francisco ferry pier. No bridge in those days. People took the ferry boat. And it was a ferry airport, small. It looked more like a sandbar than right next to the bay. Pan Am built their hangar and the maintenance area. And in 1935, the S-42 arrived. And it was, I know there's somebody here that's the son of Igor Sikorsky, but the line of Sikorsky's up to S-38, 39, 40, 41 were, had a lot of flying wires and struts, but the S-42 was real clean. It had a long hull, and the wing was mounted on the pylon. Well, there's one sitting out there, and several small ones around you can see. And there were minimum of wires and struts. But anyway, that airplane weighed 38,000 pounds, had a 118-foot wingspread, 69 feet long, and they say the top speed was 182. Well, maybe. It had 4 engines, 700 horsepower apiece, and it had a crew of 4, and the list says it could carry 32 to 44 passengers. Well, that may be so on a small flight from here to Los Angeles, but on the long overwater flight from coast to Honolulu with full tanks, as much as they could crowd into it, and the cockpit crew, there was no room for passengers, gross weight-wise. And so they flew the S-42 on their survey flights and proving flights, and they checked their, on the first flight, of course, they checked out their navigation procedures and cruise control. And in the late 35, the M-130 came out from Boston. It was 1-6, which was the China Clipper. And they rang that out and made some proving flights with it. And finally proved to the CAA, which is now FAA, that the operation was viable, safe, and convenient, and they were allowed to fly passengers. Then, while the M130 was starting to operate, Pan Am decided that, by gosh, they needed a bigger airplane than the M130. So they went to Boeing and they talked to them about a big airplane, gave them their specifications, and Boeing says, well, okay. So they finally got around to using the wing off the XB-15 bomber that they were trying to sell the Army. And they designed and bolted a hull onto that wing, and it worked very well. Before that, though, they made models and wind tunnel models and tested, and they told Pan Am, this is what we have, and Pan Am said, okay, we'll buy 6. And the 314 was 82,500 pounds, and it was 152-foot wing spread and 106 feet long. Top speed, they say, is 193, but they got that in a dive. And not recommended to exceed that. The cruising speed, they said, was 193, but 183, but that it was a little bit high. And they had 4 engines of 1,200 horsepower apiece, and it said that they could carry 74 people. Well, the Martin, full gasoline and crew, could only carry 12 passengers, and the 314 did a lot better. They could carry 25 passengers coast to Honolulu. And later on, Pan Am decided it's a pretty good deal, so they ordered 6 more. But 3 of those 6 got sold to the British, and they came with 1,600 horsepower Wright engines. And Pan Am modified those, the first ones, with the new engines so that they had a little better performance. Let's see, that's about all I had. Bill?
Thank you, Dave. A few days ago, I received a letter from an old friend, a veteran flight engineer, Tom Hugh. Tom's here today. And attached to this 2-page letter, which I'd like to read to you, was a little sticky note that said, a little homework, Bill. Yeah, I read this, and it took a microsecond to realize that Tom had written it, that it wasn't a publication that I'd ever seen or had come from someplace else. I didn't know or remember that he'd written a book, The Pan Am Journey, and this is a short excerpt from that. And soon we'll be into telling you scary stories and dangerous memories, things like that. But this is really the classic, what the airline wanted to have, routine flight to Honolulu. So if you'll permit me, I'll just read this. Clipper to Hawaii. Captain Smith was not just an airline captain. He was a master of ocean flying, with a certificate signed by Pan American Vice President Andre Priester. Before coming to Pan Am in the mid-1930s, he graduated from college, earned his Navy wings at Pensacola, served 4 years in the Naval Service, and in addition to the normal kinds of pilot certificates, he held an air transport rating, aircraft and engine mechanic, second-class radio license, and was qualified as a navigator. He had taken many company courses, including international law, company history, and meteorology. On this August afternoon of 1940, he made the takeoff in the Honolulu Clipper flying boat from the San Francisco Bay and climbed the airplane over the Golden Gate Bridge toward Hawaii, 2,100 miles away. With an estimated flying time of more than 16 hours, a large crew was necessary to allow some rest periods. There were 4 pilots, a navigator, 2 engineers, 2 radio operators, and 2 stewards, making a total of 11 crew members. On the flight segment from San Francisco to Honolulu, because of the limited payload to ensure adequate fuel, the crew usually outnumbered the passengers. The usual summer fog bank that cooled San Francisco had retreated to the ocean side of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, leaving a few white patches on the hills to the north and south and providing a fair west wind and slightly choppy water in the bay. Mrs. Smith watched the takeoff from their home in Berkeley Hills. She could not always see the airplane, but the white wake left behind was clearly visible across the water, and when the white wake went away, she knew he was safely airborne. As the airplane flew over the bridge in the fog and on towards the setting sun, everything seemed to be functioning well. The indicated airspeed matched the performance charts, as well as the flight time analysis provided by Pan Am's dispatch office. The westward progress seemed to slow the world a bit, so they enjoyed a lengthy sunset. When the sky darkened, the pilots deployed the folded curtains behind the cockpit and prepared for a long night. 2 hours later, Captain Smith allowed the third officer to relieve him and went downstairs for dinner. He chatted with the passengers as they were enjoying their cocktails and joined 3 of them for dinner at a table in the main lounge. A white tablecloth covered the dining table, and the dinner was served on special Pan American china with custom silver utensils and crystal. Soup was followed by a main course of roast beef, mashed potatoes, asparagus, and a green salad. When the table was cleared, coffee and an ice cream dessert were served. The captain declined the coffee and the after-dinner drinks, of course, and retired to the forward compartment, where he took off his uniform and slid into the freshly made bunk for a 2-hour nap. When the purser awakened him, he dressed, refreshed himself, chatted for a few minutes in the galley, and had some black coffee. The cabin was dark and quiet, as most of the passengers had retired to their berths, and the quiet rumble of the engines and gentle movement of the aircraft had put most of them immediately to sleep. Pardon me. Captain Smith climbed the circular stairs to the dimly lit flight deck and stopped at the radio operator's desk. He knew that the radio operator was probably listening to the baseball game on KPO. And so he asked, "How are the SEALs doing, Cush?" And he said, "They're doing good, Skipper." He said, "They're up 6-4 over the Oaks, and O'Doul has 2 hits and a stolen base." "Good, let me know how it comes out." This is the real world. Then he took a few steps aft to the flight engineer station. "Everything okay, Jim?" "Yes, sir. The how goes it's on track. We've gained 8 minutes on the flight plan. Number 2 engine has a sticky exhaust valve, so I'm running it cool, 10 degrees, but it may bark once in a while if that valve hangs open. Number 4 is still burning oil, but I just transferred 4 gallons to the tank." Now the moved across to the large navigator's table for a few words, then waited while he was finishing calculations. "Are the winds behaving, Magellan?" The navigator pulled out the wind chart and pointed to a circular set of lines, and he said, "I think that low pressure area is much farther north than it was forecast, so we're getting lighter headwinds than expected. I'm just now doing calculations for a 3-star fix, and I'll start shooting in 8 minutes." Captain Smith answered, "Good. When you're ready to start, let me know and I'll hand fly." On automatic pilot, the airplane developed a slight rolling motion, which was not noticeable to the passengers, but was very obvious to the navigator. With the octant glued to his eye, while trying to keep the star target in a bubble level in central focus, a slight movement of the airplane was very trying. Because of this uncertainty, the star shot was always taken 3 times and then averaged out. Now Captain Smith stepped through the light-proof curtains into the cockpit to start the shift change. The young third officer relinquished the captain's left-hand seat. Smith strapped himself into it. He settled into his comfortable command post slowly, carefully adjusted the seat position, put on his leather gloves, and tried his grip on the control wheel. The first officer on his right briefed Smith on the altitude, heading, control trim settings, and then went below for his rest period, allowing the third officer, a relief pilot, to replace him. And after a careful scan of flight instruments and the sky ahead, the captain called for an engine inspection. The third officer retrieved the Aldous lamp, a high-powered handheld lantern, and made a visual examination of the front of engines 3 and 4, and then handed the Aldous lamp to the captain, who made a similar scan on the number 1 and 2 engines on the left side. Smith disengaged the autopilot, reset the aircraft trim settings, and to be ready for the navigator's star shot. As fuel was consumed, the lower weight of the aircraft changes the flight dynamics, and the airplane flies a little differently, so the trim controls must be adjusted to maintain minimum drag. With the star shot complete, he re-engaged the autopilot, checked the headings, and the Honolulu Clipper droned on westward through the night. The navigator averaged the elevations, the upward angles of the stars, and when they were plotted on the large navigation chart, they presented a triangle. Hopefully someplace in the middle of that triangle was the probable location of the aircraft at that moment. In the meantime, the relief engineer had awakened. Most of the engineers preferred a cooler environment for the rest area, so they had installed a cot in the center wing section of the aircraft. It was a lot noisier, but it had better air circulation, and most of the engineers slept there. Before sitting down at the desk, the fresh engineer crawled out through the wing tunnels to inspect the back of all 4 engines and the fuel and oil lines in the leading edge of the wing. Then he sat for a few minutes for a briefing from the other engineer. Isn't that amazing to be able to walk through the wing of the airplane, go to the back side of each engine, and you'll hear some more stories about that in an emergency in a few minutes. In a similar manner, the 2 radio operators were keeping a 4-hour watch schedule. The stewards were taking rest turns, and one of the navigation qualified pilots gave the navigator a rest period. That's where the cross-training came in. The still air flying time between San Francisco and Honolulu was 16 hours and 12 minutes, but the prevailing westerly winds could readily increase that by a couple of hours or more. Weather forecasting was still a very inexact science, so adequate fuel reserves were carried and the crew kept a watchful eye on their forward progress and on their fuel consumption. The How Goes It chart, and you may see one during this presentation, the How Goes It chart was a graphic presentation of the flight status. It reflected fuel consumption and miles traveled and compared them to the dispatcher's forecast. A glance at the How Goes It could tell you in a mere 10 seconds more than 5 minutes of studying the numbers. On some occasions, and especially in the winter months, radical changes in the weather could result in the airplane falling way behind so that it was necessary to turn around and return to San Francisco rather than proceeding to Honolulu. A few hours after sunset, the passengers and crew a few hours after sunrise, the passengers and crew enjoyed a full breakfast and preparations began for arrival in Honolulu. Captain Smith shaved and put on a fresh shirt, as did the rest of the crew. With the mountain peaks of Hawaii in sight, the throttles were retarded and the aircraft started a quiet descent around the Diamond Head landmark. At minimum power, the aircraft swept past Waikiki, downtown Honolulu, and the Aloha Tower, then made a gentle turn into the mouth of Pearl Harbor. Almost magically, the airplane settled back into the water and quickly slowed as it sank deeper into the harbor. As the Clipper taxied towards the Pearl City terminal, the passengers stirred in preparation to disembark and then stood and waited. It took a while for the docking crew to attach the pelican hook to the rear of the airplane and the bow line to a buoy, and then maneuver the airplane backwards to the dock in front of the terminal. When all was secure, the passengers disembarked and walked up the ramp to the small terminal, wearing the leis that had been heaped on them by the Pan Am ground folks. The crew assembled on the dock, where the first officer handed the ship's papers to a representative from operations. The engineers handed the maintenance logbook to the chief mechanic, and the crew marched in formation, 2 by 2, back into the terminal building. End of Tom's first story. And Tom will be at a session this afternoon called Witness to History, which is a session devoted to writing and assistance for writers. And now I'd like to start the storytelling, the fun part. And I've asked Ross to begin with his rendition of A Dark and Stormy Night. And following this, we'll be happy to have any of you do the same or ask questions, and we'll introduce more stories if needed, but we'll start with Ross.
We departed Treasure Island in the 314 one night for Pearl Harbor, and it was a dark and stormy night. Don't most stories start that way? Well, this was in fact a dark and stormy night. We had a lot of turbulence and torrents of rain, and just beyond the halfway point, we lost number 2 engine. That's a left inboard engine. I think it was a blown cylinder, but we shut it down, feathered it, and that airplane flew all right on 3 engines, but you had to fly at a lower altitude and flew slower. Well, it wasn't very long after that we lost number 3 engine, the right inboard. Now things are critical because that big boat would not stay in level flight with only 2 engines because of all the drag. So we started our slow, gradual descent to the ocean, everyone in life jackets, the passengers and the crew. The engine was running smooth and its RPM was synchronized with the others, just 0 manifold pressure. Well, the first engineer was a big Irishman named Jack Egan, and he figured it must be a throttle problem, and rightly so. One of the unique features of that beautiful airplane was that you could open a hatch from the flight deck and step into the wing, and that's what he did, and I went with him. And out there he found that the throttle cable had a turnbuckle connector had come unwired. So Jack wired it up again. We had our throttle back, we had our engine back, and we resumed three-engine flight to Pearl Harbor. During this event, flight attendants told me that one of the passengers sitting there next to a window with his life jacket on as we were descending, we had a particularly good-sized bump of turbulence, and a torrent of rain hit the window. And he says, "Oh, we've landed. We've hit the ocean." But Captain Harry Beyer, always admired him. He was taking everything in stride, and he was a dynamic personality, far from what you'd call a retiring personality. And he was a good captain. He took care of his crew. He was known to use colorful language if the situation seemed to call for it. And being raised on a farm of horses and cows, I understood the terminology he was using. But Harry was one of many colorful personalities. I'd like to mention 2 or 3 others: Steve Bancroft, John Hamilton, Scotty Lewis, Dick Campbell, and Gentleman Jim Fleming, and many others. But it was a pleasure to know those people. Audrey Durst told me, he was chief pilot of the Atlantic for a time. He was taking a 314 off and making a takeoff in the Nile River. And the procedures were for the ground personnel to take a motorboat, we called it the launch, and they'd go out the takeoff channel and inspect it for debris, logs, or anything like that. Excuse me. Which they did. And the launch came back, and on the radio told the captain the launch runway, the channel was clear. Well, he gave it the throttle, it was rolling along, finally got it up to the step just below takeoff speed, and right in front of him emerged a hippopotamus. I've got more stories, but not much time.
Thanks, Ross. How about out in the audience? Has anybody got a question at this point, or a scary story to tell? Would you please identify yourself?
Yeah, I'm Brian. I don't have a scary story, but I do have a question about the weather challenges that Pan Am faced with the early days of the boats, particularly out in the tropical areas of the Caribbean or in the Pacific. What were some of the major challenges that the crews didn't know anything about the weather, or things that you all faced?
I didn't quite hear this question.
Could you repeat that question? Your question was whether the cruise
My recollection
had questions
back
about
1840s, maybe early
the metal
atmospheric
atmosphere.
studies and ballooning, you know.
Yeah, some of the major weather challenges that the crews face with the early flights with the boats in either the Pacific or the Caribbean.
Major weather challenges. You know, let me jump in for a second, Ross, and I'll give it back to you. But I'm still in awe of those early flyers because they flew very long missions to very small targets like islands. And they did it with a minimum navigation equipment. And they often went north-south, especially to the South Pacific. And there's a phenomenon well known to you, the asker of the question, called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, which is a band of weather that follows the sun and moves from 14 north of the equator or on the equator, spring and fall, and up north and then down south. But if you want to go to Australia, you got to go through it. There was no radar or anything else, and I can't tell you how terrified I was sitting in the cockpit the first time I went south through that thing. And that was much later. So the lack of radar, the lack of timely reporting, the thin traffic reports that came caused weather not to be anywhere near as accurate as it is now. When we would fly someplace, we would go in and brief a weather person, and that maybe we'd been on a 12-hour flight, so the information was all before they got it. But we also had very strong winds because navigation when you're stuck in clouds is really tough. We lost the Philippine Clipper up in the vicinity of Ukiah because of that. So the weather combined with the lack of aids that were available then really made it tough. Ross, can you amplify that?
Yes. Well, we had quite a bit of weather training in our ground school at Treasure Island. Learned to take the barometric readings at various locations and then connect the dots, which produced an isobar. And then from there, we were able to compose a whole structure. One thing that I didn't learn until I got involved in over ocean flying and South Pacific flying that cyclone rotates in the opposite direction below the equator. And then we had the trade winds, of course, the famous trade winds, and then we had the doldrums, and we had the typhoons, the same as a hurricane, only in the Pacific they called it a typhoon. And we relied a lot on-the-spot reports. We used to kid the meteorologists to look out the window because we didn't seem to jive with it.
A quick funny story on weather, just a second, and I'll be right back. But we had a meteorologist with the FAA, or whoever employed him on Wake Island that I finally figured out what he was doing with his cloud depiction, which they would give us for the forecast for the route. And if you looked at it just right and held it right, you could see that he had done an artistic drawing. And all of his clouds meant nothing, save for the person. We knew we were going to go anyway.
Bill?
But
Something about running short of fuel. We were coming from Honolulu to San Francisco, and we passed Equitime Point. Everything was just fine. And as we progressed, the northeast wind started to increase, and we were getting further and further behind. And I was wondering about our fuel, and as a tribute to the flight engineers, they had what they called comb shop. And that was the little extra fuel that they put on there for their wives. And by the time we landed in San Francisco, we were so light that the airplane was tipped way over on one side. And believe me, I think those fuel tanks were almost empty. Thank you, engineers, for your comb shop.
Bill?
we have a gentleman with his hand up, and there's a mic, which I believe you're a presenter later today. Possibly. Here we go.
I'm Gourdin Werney. Joe Barrows was my uncle, and I grew up around a lot of you fellows. I know a lot of the people in this audience, and I was a real Pan American fan, still am. I heard a story about this wing thing these wing lockers going out in the 314. I don't know to describe this to Joe or somebody else, but I heard the story that it was kind of a joke to get a new steward. And at night, pull the blackout curtains around the cockpit, and the whole crew go up, hide in the wing, and then buzz the steward to come up there. And of course, he wouldn't see anybody. He'd pull the blackout curtains and wouldn't be flying the airplane. It was on autopilot. I don't know. Is that a true story? One more quick story. I understand Joe spotted an iceberg off Honolulu one time. And the crew saw it, and the Coast Guard wouldn't believe it, and then they later found the iceberg. It was big enough to float all the way into the Hawaiian waters.
You know, those long, boring flights, you have to have a sense of humor. And I'm going to share with you something I did one night I'm not very proud of, to one of our illustrious early engineers. I think he lived up in the Santa Rosa area. I won't mention his name, but I saw him last night, not to talk to him. And he was well known for being able to sleep anytime, anywhere. He could sleep at a stop sign while driving his car. And we were between Honolulu and Wake, and I got the Honolulu Star Bulletin, and with my navigator's masking tape completely covered the engineer's panel. And those of you that know the 377 know that was a complex panel with throttles and everything. And when he was sound asleep and the whole cockpit was covered up so he couldn't see where he was, we rang, there was a turbo bell, big red light, and a bell would ring in an emergency. We rang that, and he came out of that chair, couldn't find his panel. And if he's here, you'll know what. And I see him. Well, they got even with me. You, sir.
Hi, everyone.
And your name, please?
I'm Ed Dover. You'll hear from me later today. However, I do have a couple of things to say about two subjects already brought up. The wing walking and the flight where the Philippine Clipper went in January 21st, 1943. Okay?
Okay.
I was on my first full-size trip as a radio operator on a B-314 that left San Francisco for Honolulu on the night of January 21st. We flew out 4 hours in turbulence I'd never experienced before in my life. The captain decided the headwinds were so strong we couldn't make it. So we turned around and went back to San Francisco. It took us 4 tries at missed approaches before we safely got on the water, landing parallel to the Oakland Bay Bridge. We went to the terminal. They said, wait, we'll see if this weather will clear and you try again. They didn't let us go home. I went into the terminal, the beautiful rotunda of that terminal on Treasure Island. I laid down on a couch, said, I'll take a nap. The next thing I knew, I woke up. It was daylight, and the terminal was abuzz with the problem of the Philippine Clipper. That night, they had come back from Honolulu to San Francisco, riding the winds, the strength of a tailwind so strong, they made it back in a record time of 9.5 hours. That coming back that soon, they were right in the thick of the weather. And the captain elected to hold and gradually seek out the hole in the clouds. And as Ross said, navigating in clouds and on instruments was a touchy thing. They miscalculated and drifted into the mountains near Ukiah, California, with the loss of all on board. I remember where I was on January 21st, 1943. How many of you? Okay. Now, on a happier note, talk about wing walking. Yes, the wing catwalks into the wing of the E-14 were real handy for doing what Ross described in repairing minor things that occurred in the back area of the engines. But there was another, somewhat lighter usefulness. When the B-314 was moved from Pearl City to the lagoon at Kehi Lagoon in Honolulu, and we took off from there, the prevailing trade wind coming down off the Ko'ola Mountains was from the east or northeast. The clipper docked at Katy Lagoon faced east or south, slightly southeast. To taxi out and turn and go down the channel to the takeoff end required that you taxi crosswind to that trade wind. So, if the trade wind was strong enough and that wing is big enough, the upward wing would come up, and if you weren't careful, the downward wing could hit the water. How to solve that problem? Easy. Multiple flight crew, 3 or 4 of us standing at the back of the cabin, and a signal from the captain, get into the wing. 4 of us raced out to the #1 engine, sat there behind this 1,600 horsepower monster while we taxied down the Katy Lagoon. We get to the other end, he starts to turn around. Now it's the other way. Race across the cabin into the starboard wing, hold that engine down until I'm through with the run up. And as soon as the captain's ready to hit the throttles, okay, come on out. I remember distinctly sitting in that nacelle, looking between my feet through cracks in the nacelle at the blue-green waters of Katy Lagoon passing by, and wondering, can he forget about us out here? That full power? That's 1,600 horses in your face. I never did, but it was an interesting experience. Thank you.
I was on B-314. We were arriving in San Francisco. I went up to the navigator. I said, how much longer? He said, about 45 minutes. Okay, I better go down and dump the garbage. I went back to the honeymoon suite, which was barren at that time, opened up the hatch, threw out 1 bag of garbage, threw out 2 bags of garbage, 3 bags of garbage, 4 bags of garbage, and then I realized the last 2 bags were linen. About that time, I looked down below. It cleared a little bit. We were over San Francisco, as a matter of fact, Fillmore Street. I rushed upstairs, I got a hold of the navigator. I said, what the hell are you doing? I dumped everything down on top of Fillmore Street. Thank God I never heard anything further. A couple more. We were about 3 hours from Honolulu, and the coffee maker failed. It failed. How the heck do you make coffee when it's cold water? So I got thinking. Had a large can of Nescafe. I dumped it out, filled up the thing with water, went upstairs, climbed inside the wing, put the can up on top of the exhaust. In about 2 minutes, I had boiling water.
Yes. Hugh, have you got a quickie for us? Because we are just about
I don't have a quickie. I was going to relate the story of one trip that I had on the 314 with Bob Howard, which was a real experience because we had an engine fire plus a lot of preliminaries. We had acronyms in those days. REM was Return Emergency Mechanical, and someone mentioned today returning because of weather. That was an REW. on this flight with Bob Howard in command, he was a wonderful person to fly with. We had multiple problems. We had a fuel pump drive failure, which caused a first return, and showing what we actually did at times, I went out to the nacelle and started taking the drive apart so that it would save some time. We got back to the dock. I'm shortening this quite a bit. We got back to the dock and it was changed permanently and then left again, but we couldn't start another engine. So out we went to the nacelle, and was a shorted booster coil. And this was at the dock, so a maintenance man had followed me out there, and we accomplished a patchwork fix to get the engine started, and off we went. But then, shortly after takeoff into climb, we had a drastic engine failure, number 3, which resulted in an engine fire. And I won't go into the details, but we were lucky. The flames went to the trailing edge there, and as I remember, the chord of the wing at that point is about 30 feet, so it was a big oil fire. And we got it extinguished with the CO2 bottles, fuel shut off, came back, and it was, for those of you who are familiar, why it was a master rod cylinder failure, and I never saw an engine so completely wrapped up as that. I couldn't believe it.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up, and perhaps we've exceeded a little bit. Time passes so quickly when you're having fun. But cherish the memories. Be proud of your company and your association with the world's very best airline. And I want to now thank John Hill, the San Francisco Museum, and the Historical Foundation for their major part in keeping the legacy of Pan American World Airways alive. Thank you, John.